From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. In other places, though, it looks like the president is explicitly trying to challenge existing legal precedent. So he's picking cases that he may lose in the lower courts, and the goal then being to get this up to the Supreme Court. And one of those, Alicia, is notable. The president recently fired a Democratic member of the National Labor Relations Board. And according to the law that created the NLRB, the president is not supposed to be able to do that except for cause for malfeasance and neglect of duty and so forth. And the idea is that this is an independent agency of the government. It's a commission with multi-members balanced on the left and right. And so that was blessed by the Supreme Court in a 1935 case called Humphrey's Executor. Alicia, to my eye, this firing of this NLRB member, Gwyn Wilcox, who has now challenged this in federal court, is an effort by President Trump explicitly to get to the Supreme Court and overturn Humphrey's executor and be able to have more direct control over some of these so-called independent agencies that the president nominates the board members or the commission members to, but then are independent of his day-to-day oversight.
Right. So a couple of things here. So you mentioned the Humphrey's executor precedent, and that stemmed from a battle between FDR and the FTC going back then. And he wanted to fire one of the FTC commissioners, and the Supreme Court said no, that the FTC is basically an independent agency, as you mentioned, that exercises adjudicative and legislative power. So it's not actually exercising executive powers, and that distinction is important because the president does have control and can fire anyone who exercises executive powers. And that was basically what the Supreme Court held several years ago when it said that the president could remove the CFPB director, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's director, for reasons other than the for-cause protections that the Democrats inserted in the Dodd-Frank Act. And so this distinction is important. The question is, does the NLRB member, in this case, exercise legislative or purely legislative or adjudicative functions, or do they also exercise executive power? And I think there's a case to be made on the latter. This is not the fight I would have chosen to pick, in part because this is, for practicality reasons, this has left the NLRB with only 2 members, so they don't have a quorum. So therefore, Republicans cannot actually go about starting to roll back the regulations and their decisions that the Biden NLRB made. And so it kind of puts things at a standstill. I also am skeptical of whether the Supreme Court really wants to revisit or take up a case that directly challenges Humphrey's executor. Now, they've been chipping away at it or just declining to extend it in other cases, such as the CELA law to the CFPB director. But this is a full frontal attack on that precedent. And I think the Chief Justice, even Brett Kavanaugh, who's been very strong on the administrative state issues, are reluctant to wade into this because the reliance affects how this would affect other agencies and the disruption that would create. And they're much more incrementalist. And so I think what you'd likely see is that the D.C. Circuit will enjoin this and under the Humphrey's executor precedent, and then it'll be up to the justices to decide whether to take up the case.
That is a possible outcome. And Alicia might be right here that President Trump is picking a fight that Chief Justice John Roberts and maybe Justice Brett Kavanaugh don't have interest in taking up at this time, overturning a 90-year-old precedent. Still, it strikes me as a case to watch, Kim, that CFPB case on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. What the majority said was essentially that the CFPB is different because it wasn't a multi-member commission. It was one director of this agency with pretty clear executive authority that was unfireable by the President of the United States. And so they distinguished that from what happened in Humphrey's executor. And I agree that the NLRB, it would be very hard to uphold this firing by President Trump of this NLRB member without overturning Humphrey's executor. There were 2 members of the court, Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice Neil Gorsuch, who in that CFPB case all but said, we think Humphreys should go. We have a separation of powers where we have legislative and executive and judicial authority in different branches, and allowing these kinds of independent agencies is mixing that up in a way that we find inappropriate. On the other hand, Kim, if Chief Justice John Roberts is looking for a case where he can give a loss to the Trump administration, this might be an easy one for him.
The lawsuit itself, which was brought by Gwen Wilcox, who was fired, acknowledges the centrality of the Humphreys executor decision to it. In fact, the lawsuit says we don't really want to be the test case for the president on this big issue. However, if we don't, he will essentially have succeeded in getting rid of that precedent anyway, with consequences for the NLRB and other agencies. Look, there's a question that even the court has acknowledged here that it's going to have to address at some point. And the grand compromise and bargain, or the legal reasoning court came up with in that case, was that Congress somehow could make certain bodies that had certain functions that might look as though things the executive branch would do, but we're going to call them bodies that instead are carrying out legislative functions. And we've had testimony or comments recently from a former FTC commissioner giving a great example of the problems of this in practice, which is the area of antitrust. Basically, the Department of Justice and the FTC both take care of antitrust, one of which is an executive branch department under the control of the president, and the FTC, which is in theory not, even though, again, the subject matter is the same. And this commissioner said, look, the honest to God truth is that sometimes when a merger case comes up, we just flip a coin to decide who gets to decide it. Well, really, this is our system in which a coin toss decides whether or not it's the president's priorities that reign or whether or not it's his independent agencies that reign. John Roberts, in that CFPB or decision from a couple of years ago, noted in a footnote that the idea that the court had that the FTC did not exercise executive authority has not withstood the test of time, meaning the court has acknowledged that whole formula that was set up hasn't really worked. So in that decision, as noted, both Thomas and Gorsuch dissented and basically said, look, we've now decimated a big portion of Humphrey's executor. We might as well just clean it up and get rid of the rest of it too. So there is some appetite on the court, but I do agree with Alicia. It's a big step, and one that therefore may be a bit off-putting to John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh, who are a little bit more slowly as she goes.
Finally, in a similar vein, let's take this listener letter. Peter writes that our last podcast on these DOGE measures did not wade into the constitutionality of some of these government agencies. He says nowhere in the Constitution does Congress have explicit authority to create agencies like the CFPB, the Department of Energy, the EPA, OSHA, etc. Congress likely justifies these agencies under the Commerce Clause, the same clause used to expand federal power far beyond what the framers intended. He suggests that Trump should force a legal battle by dissolving some of these agencies, setting up a fight over the Commerce Clause. Alicia, I wonder what you make of that. We'll give you the last word. I guess my thought is I think that would be an appropriate thing for a president to do. The president does not need to defer to the Supreme Court as an initial matter on whether something is constitutional or not. But I guess a similar sort of caution might hold here to pick that fight carefully and pick an activity of an agency that he can make a really good argument is a stretch of the Commerce Clause, because even the current conservative Supreme Court has been pretty wary about rolling back the Commerce Clause to what some of these conservatives think the founders would have intended.
Right. So we could probably have a couple hour discussion about the Commerce Clause and how it's gone off the rails.
Please, can we not?
The Supreme Court has been more reluctant just to extend the Commerce Clause, what Congress can do, rather than kind of restrict it any further. A lot of these agencies that were raised, some of these are independent agencies, or some of them are just actually under the executive branch. And if you recall, at the founding, there were only a handful of agencies. There's the State Department, Department of War, Treasury, and there was an Attorney General. And over the last few hundred years, Congress has added more and more agencies. And I think that's actually within Congress's powers to do. And many of these agencies do regulate interstate commerce, and Congress was exercising its authorities. I think some of these agencies also probably, though, are redundant, and we should delegate more of the funding and responsibilities back to the states, such as for the education department. There really is no need. And I know there's an effort by DOGE to basically eliminate this, but I think that would require an act of Congress. But why not tee that up? Maybe you could even do that through budget reconciliation.